Oh, hello. My name is Penny Wright, and we're so happy to have all of you here today. Thank you, Joanna, for doing the Zoom. We couldn't do this without people who are tech savvy, and she is one of the best. And of course, today we are grateful to have a special guest who will be introduced by David Alpern, and that is Stephen Schlesinger. You can raise your hand so we know who you are. He's an author, political commentator, and an international affairs specialist, and it's very kind of you to be with us today. And David Alpern, who is our faithful friend and presenter of many fine programs. David worked for Newsweek as a reporter, a writer, and a senior editor for over 40 years. And he also hosted a radio show for 32 years. So he's knowledgeable, well-connected, and generous. And so I think I'll turn it over to you, David.
All of those things, and glad to see you all out there in Zoomhampton for what the Rogers Library calls Coffee and Conversation about issues in the news. Of course, today's issue dominates the news, the 2020 presidential campaign, now almost over, some say thankfully, as well as the already ongoing vote and the likely outcomes. Here to discuss it with us, and I really hope you all will join in and make it a conversation, a discussion, is my longtime tennis pal, Stephen Schlesinger, author, political analyst, and activist, foreign policy advisor to the first Governor Cuomo, co-editor of the journals and letters of his late father, historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr. As mentioned, the election itself is well underway. My wife and I voted early in East Hampton on Tuesday, and I wonder, I'm going to go to gallery view, if we can see by a show of hands who else has already voted. Well, and who has voted by mail? And who is worried about their mail ballot being counted and is trying to track it with the system that they say is available? Nobody.
Mine was received. I made sure to call Suffolk County Board of Elections.
Ah,
well, that's Pat.
Yeah, when I went in person to vote, I brought 3 absentee ballots with me and deposited them in a slot at the voting place in Southampton.
That's great.
So I voted 4 times.
Well, you know, there are some places where where observers are photographing people dropping in more than one ballot in a drop box or a mailbox on the alleged presumption that they're voting, you know, multiple times. But the laws state that that third parties are entitled to deposit votes for people under specific conditions.
Yeah.
Steve, you already raised your hand, so you did vote by mail.
Yes, for the first time in my life. I've never tried it before, and I thought it'd be an interesting experiment to finally do a mail ballot. And it wasn't that difficult.
That's great. No, I mean, we took ours with us and then tore them up. Michigan's ban on open carry of firearms at the polls was blocked by a judge. Has anybody here who voted early or just happened to observe anything that they consider voter intimidation, and in what form?
Not at all. I was very impressed with the staff at Southampton College in how professional and well organized they were. And they had people going up and down the lines, giving them information, if people needed to use the bathroom, they escorted them inside. Let them know if they had an absentee ballot and were not voting in person, go to the front of the line and you'd get in right away. So I thought it was very, very well done.
In East Hampton, the woman who sort of waved you in, we said, well, how long is it going to be? And she said about an hour and a half. And sure enough, we arrived at 2:30, and at 4 o'clock on the dot, we were at the table signing in and getting our ballots. And the actual voting, of course, takes about 4 minutes. Steve, how big a factor do you think intimidation will be, whether by onlookers with guns or cameras or just aggressive eyeball?
Well, I think there'll be isolated instances, but you know, there's so much attention now on the voting process on election day, from the press, the media, from both political parties who have observers at the various voting booths. I just think it'd be very difficult at this point to get away with that kind of obvious intimidation. People showing up with guns, or sort of thugs or motorcycle gangs or whatever, trying to influence or prevent people from voting. I think they're almost both, as I said, the media and all law enforcement is on alert for this, and will be looking very closely at any such activities, literally around the country.
On the other hand, in the end, how serious a problem do you see the Trump postal ploy or the postal problem, given all the early voting in person?
Well, I think Trump may have made a mistake by emphasizing or trying to frighten people about using mail ballots. What he did by emphasizing it, really, for the last 3 or 4 months, he's encouraged people to, in fact, if they are going to vote by mail, to do it many weeks in advance. So there's literally no possibility of their ballots being discarded or not reaching in time for the election date. And I think what he has done also, he's frightened many of the opposition party, that mainly Democrats, into not only voting early, as I said, weeks in advance, but also voting early in person, so that you see these huge lines all around the country on weekly and daily news broadcasts. It's suggesting that people are very, very concerned that their vote count, and therefore they're doing everything they can to make sure that there are no possibilities that their vote will never be counted, and they do it in such a way that they make sure, as I said, early voting in both terms of balloting by mail and also by coming to the voting booths very early.
Well, that leads to my next question. According to the Washington Post, for the first time in history, it seems likely that the majority of ballots will be cast before Election Day, about 70 million by this week, I think, setting the stage for a record-breaking total turnout. For states where early ballots can be matched against a voter file, roughly 1 in 5 early votes have come from folks who did not cast a ballot 4 years ago. My sense from current polling is that Trump support was higher and broader back then. So these early voters are most probably, Democrats or independents who were unwilling to support him or Hillary Clinton, but now are up for Biden. Do you think that's pretty? In other words, there is no unexpected Trump vote that wasn't as energized or more energized at the very beginning?
I think that's pretty much right. They calculate, based on registration of these voters, that the early voting, which is almost 80 million at this point. Remember, in the 2016 election, 139 million people voted. So almost 60% of the vote has already come in, at least by the standards of 2016. Apparently, by calculation of voter registration, that vote is almost 2-to-1 Democratic. Now, of course, the Republican vote normally comes in on election day itself, so it's possible that enough Republican turnout will be making up for the deficit that the Republicans are facing in this early voting. But nonetheless, the trend seems to be in the favor of the Democrats at this point, simply because of what we're seeing in the early voting.
Well, I was going to say Republicans and Trump supporters are more likely to say they will vote on Election Day. But even if they're super energized and motivated, despite the pandemic, rising death tolls, falling economic indicators, and racial tension among minorities that Trump feels he's done so much for, I have trouble thinking that there are more of them now overall than turned out before any of these problems were on the horizon, and Trump appeared to hold out something new and different and exciting. I mean, do you think there is an unexpectedly larger Trump vote than the first time around?
Well, a lot of observers have said, well, there might be a hidden Trump vote, people who didn't want to reveal their their feelings about in favor of Trump because of their embarrassment about the way Trump has acted as president. On the other hand, there are a lot of people who feel there may be a hidden Biden vote that actually has not been really displayed because those people feel that given what happened in 2016, they themselves are chagrined to admit that they're voting for Biden at this point. My feeling is that the trend, at least according to the voting specialists, for example, the website 538, which tracks polling, and also the realclearpolitics.com, which is another website which is historically followed all of the polling trends, as well as the Cook Political Report, which is a very significant group that, again, tracks all of this out of Washington, all seem to suggest that, again, the trend is in favor of Biden by their calculations. So I suspect that this hidden Trump vote is probably going to remain hidden, and that it's not really going to be a great turnout as far as we can see at this point.
Right. I mean, that's really a polling question. I mean, I can see, I agree that people may not want to tell pollsters who they're going to vote for, but I find it hard to believe that there are more people overall who would be Trump supporters who hadn't been at the outset. So that in real terms, I'm wondering if there are limits. But I mean, we'll see that. But the logic seems to be that there's more likely disappointment and fall off, and we've seen that in his popularity, than there is actually people who didn't vote for him the first time who are now drawn to. But let's move on. Winning Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania should probably be enough to give Biden the win by many estimates. And as of a week ago, he was ahead in all three by about 5-4. It was neck and neck in Florida, which could tip things to Trump. Some say the senior vote there, both mortified and energized by the pandemic, will favor Biden. As many Hamptonites have friends or homes or both there, I wonder what you Zoomers are hearing from people in Florida about the way they see the tide going. Any special correspondents out there we can draw on? All right, Steve, what do you make of the situation in Florida right now?
I think it's neck and neck. I think Biden, has been getting 1 or 2 point leads in various polls. I think the real question, getting back to the Republican turnout on election day, particularly for senior Republicans, is COVID. I mean, are they willing to risk getting the disease by going through a long line on election day? And I think that has to put into question the breadth of a Republican turnout, particularly in a place like Florida. So I think that's something that will affect the vote. We'll see on Tuesday, but I think it could significantly affect and maybe decrease the impact of the Republican turnout.
Could I just pipe in with a question? What
Sure.
about the reported uptick in Republican voter registrations?
I think this has been very, very much a role that the Republicans have played. They've expanded registration around the country. But once again, most Republicans will be voting on election day rather than, by ballot. So the question comes back to COVID again. Are they willing to take the risk of showing up on that day? And my suspicion, particularly for older Republican voters, and seniors have traditionally been in favor of Republican candidates, whether they've been willing to take that risk on election day.
Well, we've certainly seen the turnout for Trump among his most loyal followers at these massive events. Obviously, not as senior oriented as the turnout may be, but that leads to the next question: has the motto of the first Clinton presidential campaign, "It's the economy, stupid," been correctly rewritten this time to "It's the pandemic, stupid"? Focused mainly on arguing that the Trump administration misled and mishandled it. What do you think, Steve?
Well, I think, yes, I think it has been, the COVID has replaced the economy. And you can see that in the way Trump himself addresses the issue. He complains, he has complained over the last couple of weeks that all people talk about is COVID, COVID, COVID. So he must be feeling that pressure. He must feel that it's affecting his possibility of reelection. And he wants to kind of diminish that issue as one that would be significant in the election. But he obviously is very fearful of the impact of COVID for his reelection.
To what degree do you think anti-pandemic measures have hurt national and personal economic situations so severely that stressing that issue could backfire with many voters? And also, has violence associated with protests against police killings of African Americans given serious heft to law and order pitches?
Well, I think Law and Order was his attempt to change the subject for the fall. He was trying to address all the outbursts of violence, particularly right now in Philadelphia, which the last couple of days has had riots. But it hasn't really seemed to shift the trends in favor of Biden. I think Law and Order is more isolated in its impact. There have been outbreaks here and there, but COVID is every day. I mean, you can't get rid of it. You see the incidents increasing in states around the country. All of us have friends who have been affected by COVID, and Trump seems to fumble the issue of COVID. Doesn't really. He keeps saying it's going to go away, or we're going to get vaccines in time, but all of that seems very vague. It doesn't seem to have any suggestion that there's any immediate planning to take issue and take care of these COVID outbreaks. And so I think he can't really go back to law and order. He can't really go back to the economy as long as COVID is in the view of everybody on a daily basis. And so I think that's really going to be the key issue influencing the outcome of this election,
both as an issue and as the environment that people have to vote in. Let's look more closely at the Democratic ticket. I think Steve and I disagreed early on about who Biden should run with. So Steve, tell us how your thinking evolved on the second slot and how you think Kamala Harris is doing in the campaign now.
I think she's doing well. I actually would have preferred Elizabeth Warren, only because I think she had plans and a sense of a kind of historic way of dealing with the presidency that comes from her background as a law professor and a person who's been long involved in policy issues. But I think there's no question that Kamala Harris has a really well-respected political background. I mean, she was, after all, Attorney General of California, which is, if you cut it out from the United States, would be the sixth largest country in the world. So she really, the fact that she got elected in that state tells you something about her tremendous political abilities as a candidate. And she also ran an office which I believe had almost 20,000 employees. So she does have managerial experience as well as very good political instincts. And I think that's starting to show in her performance on the campaign trail.
What do other people think about Harris's performance so far? Comments? Critiques?
No one dares.
No. Well, there's that.
Great.
Alice, what did you say, Alice?
I said I love her. I think she's great. I'm thrilled that she was the choice. Yeah, I think she was the most sensible choice, because I don't think Elizabeth Warren, as much as I love her, I think she would have turned off a lot of people as that vice presidential candidate. And I think when it came down, I mean, Amy Klobuchar I thought was great too, but I feel like at this time in our history right now, I think choosing Kamala Harris was a great choice, and she's whip smart. And I mean, I was wishing she could debate Trump. That's what I kept wishing, but that was.
I think it may go down as the best decision Biden makes, even if he's president for 4 years.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I agree
and-
with Alice on everything she said about. I think Elizabeth Warren could have been, while she is smart and has plans, could have been divisive because she has such a liberal vein. And I think Biden is able to run a little more center, which you asked about Florida. I have cousins there who voted for Trump because of the economy. They hate him. And they've said that if somebody in more centralist runs on the Democratic ticket, they would vote for that person.
And I think that the very virtues that Steve thought of in the beginning, and many people did at the beginning, could have been operationally difficult for someone in the second slot. I mean, she had her own agenda, but she would have to be, in a secondary role to the president. So I think that both, if there is a Biden administration, and to get to a Biden administration, he made the right choice against a lot of pressure from very smart.
I would mention one other reason why I think in the end this was a shrewd choice, which is that when Kamala Harris gives up that Senate seat, and it's the California governor has the right to appoint a successor, and that is a Democratic governor in California. So the Democrats will not lose a seat in the U.S. Senate as a result.
And they would have if. Go ahead.
They would have if Warren had run.
Right. Well, let's look. I'm sorry, I don't mean to squelch much.
I'm just butting in, but I was just going to say, I hope he uses Elizabeth Warren and Pete Buttigieg and Yang, all of them. I mean, it was such a great group of people, so smart, with so much to offer. I wish his whole cabinet would be filled with the people who ran for president. I really do. So
I agree.
Let's look at Biden himself. Does he inspire all the confidence a presidential nominee should, at least enough? Or do his live appearances to some degree help Trump's taunts about age and infirmity strike home? Let's hear from the audience first, then I'll hear what Steve thinks. Comments on Biden as a candidate?
I have to say, Trump has said it so many times, even though I know he lies every time he opens his mouth. There's a bit of me that I watched the debates to see if he actually held up with a little bit of trepidation. And there's no way in God's earth I would ever vote for Trump. But I think Trump has done enough bad mouthing to put a little question in my head anyway.
Steve, what's your view of Biden as a candidate? Is he wise not to appear too often side by super charismatic Obama?
Well, I think in a funny way, Biden is the perfect candidate for 2020 because he's running against a loudmouth who lies constantly and screams at people he doesn't like. And, he reminds me, I don't mean this in an invidious way, but when Ed Koch ran for a third term against David Dinkins, people had gotten tired of his act. He was not as disgraceful as Donald Trump, but he was a loudmouth. He yelled at people. He got in people's faces day after day. The voters got tired of that, and I think they also got tired of the Trump act. So that a more quiet, composed figure like Biden almost seems like a perfect antidote to the kind of figure that Trump represented. And Biden, in a funny way, by actually campaigning out of the basement, of course Trump has accused him of that, did in a way enhance the flaws of Trump, because he allowed Trump to keep speaking in the ways that alienate people, while himself just appearing on a kind of here and there basis as a kind of as a reminder that there are cool and collected possible candidates that you can support, namely Joe Biden. I think that contrast eventually became very clear cut and enabled people to finally trend towards Biden as the days come down to the final election.
Well, it is true that, I mean, we used to complain there's too much television in politics, and now politics has essentially become television. And consciously or unconsciously, I think people make a judgment about who they want to see on their screen every night, you know, for the next 4 years. It may not be a rational thought, but they're reacting not only to issues and policy and history, but to what they see on the screen, and the screens have come to dominate us. I think your Koch reference is interesting because Trump came to office from entertainment, and I think over his years in City Hall, Koch moved from politics into entertainment. I mean, he became a TV personality. But let's move on again. Because
David, could I jump in with a question?
Sure.
So we have not only a presidential election, but our congressional district. And I see someone in our audience who I would love to have a comment from if he cares to comment, which he may not, which is Carl Grossman, who's a very respected journalist for 50 years here. Carl, I don't know if you could comment on the congressional seat up for grabs, but if you could, I would love to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, let's see, am I?
Yes.
Yeah.
Good. I would not be surprised if Zeldin lost in a strong vote in Suffolk County for Biden, that he'd be washed away. On the other hand, you got to remember that district, first congressional district, comprises so much of Brookhaven town, which includes real Selden and Center Reach and Coram, you know, real Republican hotspots of Suffolk County. So he might have the numbers out of Brookhaven town to do well and win. On the other hand, he might. It's hard for me to guess. When I used to be at the Long Island Press, I used to, on the weekend before the election, have to write like predictions. And this one, I would have, if I'd still be at the old Long Island Press, be nervous in regard to giving a prediction. But again, I would not be surprised if Zeldin was defeated.
What about all the new voters out here?
Well, that's going to help. You know, that's going to help the refugees from the city who are voting as I originally was. So I don't speak negatively of that. Many years ago. Yeah, I think that's going to help too. But again, you got to be concerned in terms of how to figure out this first seat race. The Republican vote in like Brookhaven town, it is a town supervisor is a Republican. On the town board, everybody but one council person is a Republican. On the other hand, legislators from Brookhaven, Carahan, others are Democrats. So again, very hard to predict, but I think you're correct. I think the new registrants, the new voters in Suffolk County who come from the city will help Nancy Goroff.
Well, I think the most significant thing is that she's so close now in the polling that we can even talk about it. I mean, it's not a foregone conclusion. But let me move on and go back to the national campaign. Given Trump's repeated warning that he could only lose in an unfair election, and now with a presumably sympathetic 6-3 majority on the Supreme Court, how much legal wrangling do you all expect now over voting practice and vote counting? Days, weeks, months? Let's start with Steve, and then we'll get other views.
Well, I obviously it depends a lot on the election outcome. If it's a blowout for Biden, there won't be any legal wrangling. But presuming there isn't, and that there particularly are close votes in key states like Pennsylvania, obviously the Republican Party will contest the election, and Trump will have his lawyers all over that outcome. And I think in that respect, the Supreme Court could play a key role. It is interesting to me, though, that Amy Coney Barrett has not taken part in any of these recent decisions on extended vote count for North Carolina and Pennsylvania, which makes me think that she may not be a player in some of these court decisions after the election. I may be wrong about that, but she seems to have absented herself on the grounds that she's not really caught up with all the jurisdictional issues related to voting. But nonetheless, that still leaves a 5-3 majority for the remaining justices, so that the conservatives could affect the outcome. On the other hand, Kavanaugh and Justice, the Chief Justice, have both been on the side of the Democrats on these two issues of extended vote counting in Pennsylvania and North Carolina. So it's a little hard to figure exactly how the decision would come down in this present court makeup.
Let me insert this. One constitutional scholar has maintained that the country should be protected by the rule of law. Quote, the Constitution is clear that on January 20, the term of a current president ends, he says. And it's also clear that if there isn't someone whose votes to be the new president have been certified by Congress, which may well be significantly more democratic by that point, then the line of succession kicks in. And if Trump's term legally comes to an end and Vice President Pence is along with it, then the next in that line of succession would be House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. Could increasingly empowered Democrats run out the legal and political clocks enough to make it that simple? What do you think, Steve?
I think we're getting into very obscure kind of reasoning at this point. I mean, yeah, I suppose anything's possible in this crazy year, but to have the election undecided all the way up till January 20th of the nomination of a presidential inauguration seems to me very unlikely. But from my point of view, if the Democrats have a candidate in Speaker Pelosi at that time, that's fine for the Democratic Party. So one can't discount it, but I think it's very, very unlikely.
Well, turning to post-election period, I'm wondering how many in the audience expect there will be violence by disappointed partisans like the far-right Proud Boys whom Trump told to stand by. Let's see some hands and thoughts about what you're actually fearing or expecting. Yes, go ahead, Casey.
Well, I think there can only be violence if there is a resistance, if they want to go out and create a problem. Any of us or anyone who is on this side of the issue should just back off and let the police handle it. If there's no one to fight, then who are they going to fight?
Anybody else?
I have one thought about not violence, but massive protests. If by some odd circumstance, Trump wins the Electoral College and not the popular vote, I think there will be just protests like you just, I just think people, because obviously people have been stung in the past in this way. And if it happens again, I think it'll just be mayhem. I really do. Not violence necessarily, but I just think people will have, there'll be a tipping point in our democracy.
Well, let me pursue that. Some on the left are already talking about protests, demonstrations, and alliances with mainstream centrist groups and institutions who might unite to block Trump administration operations, business, banks, politicians, bureaucracies. We saw the medical profession for the first time taking a stand with the New England Journal of Medicine. Quote, obviously, the Trump family is not going to be able to run the government by itself, says an activist sociologist named George Lakey. They'll need institutional support. The question is, how do we as activists go after these pillars in such a way as to encourage them to buckle and allow the Trump regime or his attempted regime to fall? Who thinks that's realistic? Who would support it? What do you think, Steve?
I I mean, you know, the Democrats have won 6 out of the last 7 presidential elections, but 2 of those elections went to the Republicans because of the Electoral College. My own feeling is that should a similar sequence happen in 2020 as happened in 2016, there would be such outrage in this country that I do believe that there would be a tremendous resistance at that point to having this happen again. How this resistance would be carried out, I'm not exactly sure. But let's say that the Democrats won the Senate and House again and the Senate this time around, and yet Trump got the presidency. I think that the Democrats at that point would impeach him, take him out, because at that point they would have the votes to do it, obviously through the House and the Senate. And I think that would be one response that would be possible.
What about a Democratic counteroffensive by court packing, or is that too slippery a slope?
Well, you know, court packing can mean a lot of things. One of the obviously, Roosevelt tried it in 1937, and it didn't work. But it did work in the long run because the very threat of court packing convinced many of the conservatives on that particular court to start either retiring or voting in favor of the New Deal programs. My feeling is that the Democrats have already done a shot over the bow to the conservatives on the Supreme Court by suggesting, as Biden has, that they're going to have a commission look at the restructuring the court system. He said it's going to take 180 days, and he's going to have Republicans and Democrats on that commission. But the point is that Biden's basically saying, we're not going to let this conservative majority get away with it, and we're going to do something about it. And whether it means adding justices to the court, or the alternative is a proposal which is now in Congress to have an 18-year limit on the service of any particular justice. So there are going to be restraints that the conservatives on the Supreme Court are going to have to take into account as they make decisions during a Biden administration.
There have been, David, there been a couple of suggestions I've seen in the Times in the last few days. Actually, one was an op-ed piece by Charles Freed. I think he's a law professor at Harvard, saying stacking the court is not a good idea, but it may be the only thing, you know, the best option. Another, either it was a letter to the editor or an op-ed piece, talked about actually making the size of the court smaller down to its original number of 6, and, you know, which should please the original texture, you know, people. You know, and so eliminating those last 3 Supreme Court justices. And another op-ed piece argued about changing the way that cases are chosen by the Supreme Court. In other words, giving them less say over what they're going to hear. What do you think about that?
Steve?
Well, I mean, I think that those are the kind of things that will be considered in this Biden commission. I'm not sure that shrinking the court is a particularly good way to do it. And also, if you have 6 members, it's very difficult to get a firm, clear decision because you can block each other 3-3 votes, and therefore there's no precedence being set by the court. But I do think that the Democrats, anyway, have made perfectly clear that if this conservative court, which in many ways does not represent the feelings of most people in this country. For example, on the abortion issue, abortion is, I believe, supported now by between 60 and 70% of the American population. If they intend on holding to these very unpopular positions, I do think that there will be response by the Democrats in terms of changes on the court.
All right, I have my eye on the clock, Penny, as I promised. So my last question for you all and for Steve is what form the Republican Party will take post-election. If Trump wins, it's obviously likely to be tied more closely to his priorities and proclivities. But if he loses, can it return to an earlier, more independent incarnation, or do the factions and forces that he inspired and empowered maintain a hammerlock or at least significant influence and find new avatars in politics or entertainment or God forbid, reality TV. Will the toothpaste go back into the tube? First Steve, then the rest.
Well, you remember the candidates for the court that Trump reviewed and finally put on his three choices. They're fairly strong ideologues. So I suspect that once the court gets going, and now Amy Coney Barrett is in play, they are going to be very, very rigid in their decisions. And I think that is going to actually trigger a response that from the Democrats that is going to be very controversial, but ones that really reflect, be partly out of the feeling that the court no longer represents the true feelings of the American people, that it's too one-sided. So
I'm asking about the Republican Party. What will the Republican Party's future be after Trump?
I'm sorry, I misunderstood that. Yeah, I think the Republican Party is going to be very divided. I think you're going to still have a Trump faction, and you're going to have a more moderate faction. But that's been true of the Republican Party for years. I mean, that's nothing new. The Trump faction had its antecedents in the party for decades. It's just that Trump kind of expressed those feelings in his very demagogic way, and got elected president on that basis. So I think you have to remember that before Trump, you had two Republican nominees, Romney and McCain, who were regarded as rather moderate in the party. So it's not as if the party has been totally demobilized by the Trump candidacy. I mean, McCain or Romney candidacy in the future could repair their party fairly quickly. So we shouldn't overlook, or at least pretend, that the moderate wing has been totally demolished by Trump. It could, I think, very well come back in 2024.
Any other views?
You have time for another question on a different subject?
Sure.
Okay, I shot you a text, but
I was about to read it, but go ahead. Say it in your own words.
So it's about demographics. Trump loses, it seems, all segments except for white males. I mean, why is there this discrepancy between the overwhelming support by white females versus white males?
Women are smarter.
I buy that.
I think we'll make that the last word. All right. I think we're out of time, Penny. So thanks again to Steve Schlesinger, to Penny Wright and Joanna Farron of the library, to you all for Zooming with us. See you for an election post-mortem with Princeton professor Julian Zelizer, whose book is about the way Newt Gingrich set the stage for Trump's takeover of the Republican Party. And we'll talk about it in the context of what we know about the election results a week later, if we know anything at all. So thanks again. Until then, stay well. Thank you, Penny. Thanks all. This has been great.
I'd like to just say a quick goodbye and to also thank Mr. Schlesinger from the library. We're so grateful to you. We're grateful to David.